afternoon, everybody. I'm Jalil Yadav. On behalf of DG USI, General VK Sharma, I welcome all of you to today's discussion, and I think it's quite a happening topic: shifting nuclear order, proliferation, brinkmanship, and possible new entrants to the nuclear club. We are fortunate to have two of the eminent personalities here. We have Brigadier Arun Saigal, who has been with the USI 20 years ago, and he has been with various think tanks thereafter, IDSA, USI, then he's been with the Delhi Policy Group, and now he's with the Forum for Strategic Initiatives as the director. And he has done a yeoman service into the strategic world, and he's been into a lot of policy writing and others. So he's with us today, who's going to speak after me to give you a brief insight into what Professor Nicholas is going to speak to us. A word about, I'm not getting into details before that thing will be flashed. Professor Nicholas is a professor of international relations at the University of Birmingham, and he's been doing work on nuclear responsibilities program with special reference to India-Pakistan relations. And he has, to his credit, some very interesting publications: The Security Dilemma, Fear, Cooperation and Trust in World Politics, Saving Strangers, Humanitarian Intervention in International Society, Trusting Enemies, Interpersonal Relationships and International Conflict, and a new book which is likely his co-authored is Atomic Bonds, Interpersonal Relationships in International Crisis. So we have an eminent person here to speak on the subject. Just a few words before I request Brigadier Saigal to take on. I think we all are very well aware that the nuclear thing started in 1945, or this particular force. So while the nuclear thing started in 1945, thereafter we have coming up, but we are not seeing its use till now. But however, it continues to remain as a weapon of deterrence. Just to recap, that while after 1945, the world got divided into two camps. We have seen the Cold War period proliferating these weapon systems into thousands. We reached a stage where we came across a theory of mutual assured destruction. Once that was there, then we graduated further that we should have a second strike capability, and we branched off to triad so that it could be land, air, or from the sea. Thereafter came something like tactical nukes, because they felt that a major weapon, nuclear weapon, could not be used. So the concept of tactical nukes came, and lately it has been brinkmanship and demonstrations. So the three ongoing places in the world: Russia, Ukraine. I think Russia at one stage called for the nuclear weapons. In the Western Pacific, North Korea has been demonstrating its capability, and in the Middle East also, there has always been a threat that they want to, curtail the possibility of Iran acquiring the nuclear weapons. So it is being talked about, and I think a lot of people are now wanting to get into this club, because if it is being used as a weapon of coercion or a capability of coercion, then there is an aspiration in certain other countries to acquire this thing. So it is going to further proliferate. A lot of questions have, this thing. I myself have one in my mind as to when not even one nuclear weapon has been fired or allowed to be fired till date in the last 80 years. Why do we require thousands of them? Right. So such like questions are in our mind, and I think that today's talk will, enlighten us on a few of these aspects, and you are free to ask questions after the things are over. So with this little prelude, may I request Brigadier Saigal sir to have a say, sir.
Thank you. The point we have to understand is this. I wish to highlight it. While the global order is in a state of flux, and we are looking at a multilateral global system, the same issue is applied to the nuclear order. Nuclear order is in a state of flux, and is becoming increasingly multipolar. The bipolarity of the global system, which was created by the United States and Russia being the two great super nuclear powers, is no longer the central issue. There are many more players. The China is an important and a very salient player to challenge this order. And following that, as he will talk about in the second video, we have had a proliferation of nuclear weapon states, although still operating outside the NPT, not accepted within the NPT, but nevertheless they are credible nuclear powers. So what we are seeing now is four shifts. Shift number one is United States, Russia, and China are spending trillions of dollars upgrading the nuclear arsenals. The upgradation of nuclear arsenals is being taken up by these countries primarily on the basis of the fact that they believe that their primacy is challenged. Till the Ukraine war started, it was a word which was called unipolar war, the unipolar movement of the United States. Following the Ukraine war, the world is dividing into two blocks, what we call as the Atlantis block and the Erosion block. But beyond that, what is happening is there are a large number of other nuclear weapon states that are being used. Is that in this multipolar nuclear order, in the older system, they had arms control treaties, they understood what was mutual assured destruction, that something like Jadhav talked about. But in this system, who's the controller? Who's stopping whom? Who's stopping expansion of nuclear states? Added to that is this whole notion of regional security, particularly the European security is throwing up a huge challenge. The European security and the Trump's 2.0's attitude towards NATO, where he wants to pull out of the NATO, or he's concerned about providing the extended deterrence to European states, is forcing them to relook at their nuclear calculations and to protect continental Europe. They are looking at revamping their nuclear order. In that, must have read and seen enough writings that how France and UK are trying to provide some kind of credibility to mostly the Eastern European states who are on the front line of this whole thing. So this is one aspect. Come to the Indo-Pacific near home. What is happening in Indo-Pacific? Indo-Pacific, what is happening is as per my reading, who follows these issues closely, I see that the Trumpian system which is coming about, or what is called the new Pacific thinking of the Trump, is making people like Japan and Korea very uneasy. The whole idea of the strategy which the Trump is following is that the Biden strategy was based on the simple fact of what is called the credible deterrence. Now the strategy is no longer credible deterrence. It is collective deterrence. From credible it is moving to collective. So what does collective deterrence mean? Basically it means Japan and Australia and Korea have to manage their own as within the overall architecture of the American position, American status, American scale. So this is having people from Japan, etc., and Korea having a relook. Coming home, in our part, three things are happening. Issue number one, I talked about the Chinese upgradation of nuclear arsenal, new systems. DD space is there, he understands how space is being weaponized, and all kinds of things are happening. The next issue along with that is that we are also seeing a great degree of shift in the collaboration between the Chinese and the Pakistanis. I want people to note that the Pakistanis been given a credibility of their second strike capability, not only in terms of providing them with nuclear capability, but providing them with the means like radio systems, means of satellite imagery, means of ISR, to be able to launch credible first strike followed by a second strike. The second area where they are being supported by the Chinese is that the new Hangar class submarines which are going to come up. The first one is going to get, I think, into service this year or early next year. Will have tubes which will have capability of firing NASA type of missile system with about 800 kilometers range. So we are looking at that within our own area. So things are shifting, things are changing. Where so we are in a kind of a nuclear order which is in a huge state of flux, and where everybody is trying to create his own capacity and capability depending on how he feels the threat. Professor Miller to take the stage, he has a much more substantive presentation. Is this whole issue of emerging and disruptive technologies? They are making a huge difference in this whole thing. I will not talk more about it because he's going to be talking about it. And the organization which he works, and I have had the chance to be part of that, and we have come up with a big report on the role of emerging and disruptive technologies in strategic stability, and it is focused on India-Pakistan dyad. Okay, it's available on the net. You can download it, but if anybody wants it, I'll be happy to share it. With these small remarks, I request Professor Wheeler to take the stage.
Thank you for inviting me to speak here. It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon to speak at such a venerable institution as the United Service Institution of India. And I hope what I'm about to say will map on to some degree to what Brigadier Segal said, but also hopefully open up some different themes for discussion. So, as Major General Yadav said, I'm a Professor of International Relations at the University of Birmingham, and I'm also a non-resident Senior Fellow at BASIC, the British-based think tank, and we've been working in South Asia for the last few years with partners. Very much emphasise that the work we do is co-created with partners in both India and Pakistan. We work closely with the Rabi Akhtar at the University of Lahore, and with Ruby Neog in the Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies here in Delhi, and with many other interlocutors, including, Brigadier Segal. So what I wanted to do this afternoon in my half an hour, which I'll try and stick to, is first of all very briefly skip through, in a sense taking the invitation up about the nuclear order.
You want the slides to be up?
We had a round table here that Brigadier Segal was part of yesterday, and that's the reason I'm in India again, albeit a very short trip, on the concept of the third nuclear age. My colleague, Professor Andrew Futter at the University of Leicester, has a major project in that space. He's the expert on this and his team, but he very kindly brought me along to offer some thoughts and perspectives from the work I do. So what I want to do this afternoon is quickly go through the first nuclear age, the second nuclear age, and the third nuclear age. I'm committed to the idea that nuclear age is an interesting way of thinking about things, but I would also emphasize that I think there are continuities that are important to remember as well. We don't just break from, so the challenge, I think, is to think about the relationship between continuity and discontinuity, and to make the proposition that there is a nuclear age change. You need to really show that the discontinuities are that much greater than the continuities. But I do want to emphasize some of the continuities, which I think are very important, on the kind of, if you want, the more sort of cognitive and psychological side of the story, which I hope will become clear as I go along. And then I want to talk about the presence of multiple nuclear adversaries. I want to ask the question whether those multiple nuclear adversaries are more risk acceptant, whether there is a changing way of thinking about nuclear weapons that, far from pushing them into the background of international politics, is actually making them far more salient and far more significant. I want to try and explore briefly the issue of EDTs, where I'll talk about our new report, Basics new report that I was part of, the writing, which was launched yesterday, and which I do hope you'll have a chance to look at. And then I'll talk a little bit very quickly about the erosion of US extended nuclear deterrence, and then I hope in the last 5 minutes to offer some hopeful messages about what frameworks we might develop. So that's the plan. Let me see if I can make this work. Yeah. So Brigadier Segal briefly talked about the first nuclear age is clearly characterized by Cold War bipolarity, fundamentally, stabilized by arms control, and this condition of mutual vulnerability. Now, I do want to emphasize that it's not quite as straightforward as that, because throughout the first nuclear age, which I'm dating to the end of the Cold War, there were, of course, attempts by the United States and the Soviet Union to break out that condition of mutual vulnerability, sometimes more actively than others. But in general, I think it's fair to say there was no kind of, and if you go to something like the Reagan-Gorbachev statement from November 1985, which becomes a transformational moment in the end of the Cold War, the two leaders commit to the position that nuclear war cannot be won, it must never be fought. I'm not very sure what's happened to my 2 bullets at the bottom there, apologies. They shouldn't be there, so we'll just focus on the first 3 bullets. Apologise for that. So I think the first nuclear age, Fritz Ermoff, who was involved in looking at the English crisis of November 1983 later in the US administration, he had this very nice line where he said we've had each other's cookbooks. And the question about the third nuclear age is whether we still have each other's cookbooks. So I think communication, you go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, the most dangerous moments in the nuclear era. What comes out of the Cuban Missile and the importance of having lines of communication, knowing one another's red lines, and recognizing that. And also the other feature I think which is important, which is a contrast with South Asia, is that there was a belief between the superpowers that any kinetic activity between them would escalate, and that you couldn't control that it would go all the way to the nuclear level. And we argued in a very interesting report, I think, that we produced last year, that basically produced last year for that as well. We argued that that's different in South Asia because there's a kind of confidence here that you can engage in a certain level of kinetic activity without crossing one of those red lines, and I think that's really interesting. And it sets up this idea that we shouldn't just impose templates from the Cold War period onto regions, and it opens up the whole point, the flashpoint mythology and so on, which we've done a lot in our work, I think, to try and debunk. Okay, so the end of the Cold War then leads, as Brigadier Segal says, to the second nuclear age. Paul Brackett wrote this very interesting book in which he titled it The Second Nuclear Age. Fundamentally, of course, the end of the possibilities and the prospects are very different order in the early 90s and mid-90s. And the focus shifts. The risk of major power wars is a historic low. There's an emphasis on arms control with the agreements coming out at the end of the Cold War in the Gorbachev period, devised the Soviet Union, the N5, India and Pakistan, of course, as you know all too well, announced their entry into the nuclear club with the tests in 98. DPRK, of course. And there's the question about how to manage the break of the Soviet Union, what to do about the loose nukes problem. And this characterizes the second nuclear age. And I think the question then is, at what point does the third nuclear age come here? And we have this problem about, enough of a break to warrant the claim that we can talk about a third nuclear age. And so what do I think characterizes it? So here we have Tony Radakin, the CDS in the UK, of course, and many of you know, and he set up RUSI, obviously parallel organization to the one that we're in here, that we're at the dawn of the third nuclear age. So here's a top level British military officer, CDS, making the statement that the third nuclear age is a useful frame for thinking about this world. So what characterizes it? So I suggested here that unregulated great power competition is a critical aspect of it. So the return to great power competition. But of course, it's a very different, whereas of course the first nuclear age was characterized by bipolarity, the demise of arms control. So, if New Start doesn't get a lease of life by early next year, there'll be no arms control architecture left in place. That's quite, when you think about arms control, the concept of it goes back to the early 1960s, developed by Thomas Schelling and Morton Halperin in the United States, and by Hedley Bull in the United Kingdom, Bull's brilliant book, Control of the Arms Race. Arms control fundamentally predicated on the idea that adversaries can share a common interest in restraint. Arms control isn't about necessarily reducing weapons, that's a myth. Arms control fundamentally is about stability. It's about putting in place a framework of regulation that recognizes the need for restraint in the relationships between military competitors. And that framework between the major nuclear armed states, and obviously China's not part of any of this, but between the United States and Russia, that framework is now lying it's on life support, certainly. INF, of course, is gone. New Start is in deep trouble. The Russian position at the moment is that they don't want to talk about any of this until Ukraine is sorted out. And so very difficult to make any progress. I suspect we're not going to see any significant progress at PrepCon in a couple of weeks' time in terms of moving forward on any of this. The NPT looks extremely unlikely to there will be a kind of consensus document when they get to the final conference. So multiple nuclear challenges is clearly an aspect of this. We'll come on to this. The risk accepting question I think is fascinating because if we go back to the first nuclear age, the character, despite a lot of talk in the strategic studies literature and the RAND Corporation people and Schelling himself, in the end, when the superpowers got into a crisis together over Berlin in October 1961 and then fundamentally Cuba in October 1962, they were extremely cautious. Great efforts were made on both sides to ensure that the crisis was managed and de-escalated. There was no nuclear brinkmanship. There was no attempts at manipulating. The United States had a massive numerical advantage over the Soviets in Cuba, but the US didn't. Kennedy didn't feel that emboldened him in any way to play a more brinkmanship game with Khrushchev. And indeed, far from it, Kennedy looked for the Golden Bridge that Khrushchev could have walked across to de-escalate the crisis. And they found that Golden Bridge, and I'll say a little bit more about that at the end. But in the speech, the brilliant speech Kennedy made, was transformed by the missile crisis. In the brilliant speech he made at the American University in June 1963, he said the greatest lesson, that we need to learn is never humiliate a nuclear-armed state. Always make sure that there's that we don't burn out bridges. That we have to recognise the importance of finding this basis of cooperation with the Soviet Union. And then I'll say a bit about, come on to say a bit more about EDTs and then the erosion of extended deterrence. So, sorry, I'm going on that. Right. So multiple nuclear adversaries. So I think what we have to think about is just what's kind of changing in terms of US nuclear strategy at the moment. And I think the really interesting thing is the United States believes increasingly that it has to be able to manage a combined threat from both Russia and China. And this has really profound implications for arms control. Because if you believe that you've got to have parity in warheads with both Russia and China, that inevitably means, mathematically, that you must have superiority over each of them individually. But the United States is starting to think about how it manages and sizes its force structure for this problem of managing potentially a nuclear crisis and potential conflict in two quarters at the same time. And so I think you can't understand China's nuclear modernization, which has profound implications, of course, for India, without recognizing this wider context of US nuclear strategy responding to this idea that they're dealing with two nuclear peers, Russia, a rising nuclear China, that they have to find a way of managing. And so that's setting up what Ravi Akhtar calls the nuclear tetraplex, where we get a four-way set of relationships then between the US, China, India, and Pakistan. And picking up Brigadier Segal's point about the strategic partnerships, as we call them in our new report, between India and the United States on the one hand, and Pakistan and China on the other. So I think the fundamental question then is, what are the possibilities of restraint and indeed arms control in a world of multiple nuclear adversaries? Because how do you reassure other members of the nuclear landscape that the capabilities you're developing are only for deterrent purposes? So I've suggested here that how does China reassure India that the nuclear capabilities China's developing, because it fears that its own assured destruction capability is hostage, if China fears that assured destruction capability is under threat from the United States, which it clearly does, and then develops nuclear capabilities to try to protect its assured destruction capability, that's got profound implications for India, because how does India know that those nuclear capabilities are not going to be one day turned against India? I think that's a real profound problem. We didn't have that in the Cold War. We didn't have anything like that. In the first nuclear age, you didn't have that problem because you had a bipolar world. And of course, that then, if you're then sitting in Islamabad, that then raises concerns. Because then what Islamabad sees is India developing nuclear capabilities, which it might well justify as being a response to China, but could potentially be used against Pakistan. And so then that sets up the problem of you have a nuclear competition within this tetraplex between the four. So this multiple nuclear adversaries challenge, I think, is profoundly difficult. What I'm very interested in is how you bring reassurance and restraint to these relationships to try to make it less unregulated, which is this key characteristic I'm talking about. But how do you do that in a situation? How do you do reassurance in a situation where there are multiple nuclear adversaries? Because no matter how much India says to Pakistan that these nuclear capabilities are not aimed at Pakistan, Pakistan can't be assured that in a crisis situation, it might not find itself facing those capabilities. And similarly, India can't be assured that China might not use its newfound capabilities to coerce and menace India. So that poses really real challenges. Whilst the United States is committed to this idea that it needs to have a nuclear capability that can manage nuclear threats from two theaters simultaneously, and believes that it has to have at least parity with the two of them combined in warheads, whilst it's thinking in those terms, it's setting up dangerous strategic chain effects, if you want, within this region in particular. And I think the problem then is compounded if we look at this question of risk acceptance. So Thomas Schelling famously said in his book Arms and Inflating, the question is whether these multiple nuclear adversaries today are thinking about nuclear weapons in terms. Khan was the inspiration for Kubrick's figure, Dr. Strangelove, and Kubrick spent quite a bit of time talking to Khan and Schelling. Schelling was an advisor on the film, but I think he had Khan in mind, I think, when he came up with Dr. Strangelove. And Khan's argument was, and I've got the long quote there, was that ultimately you have to be willing to get on the escalator in a crisis situation Because if you don't get on the escalator, there's always the possibility that the other side will. So you're faced with this problem that you're up against an adversary. If you believe you're up against an adversary who's read Herman Cahn's book and thinks that the way to win a crisis is to have escalation dominance, then you've got a real problem. Because either you back down or you yourself get on the escalator. So once you start to get into this risk acceptance discussion, it seems to me, it becomes very, very challenging. Because thinking about nuclear weapons in terms of escalation dominance, in terms of crisis behavior, would be very different from the first nuclear age. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't a lot of military technical discussions around escalation dominance in the Pentagon and the equivalent in the Soviet Union. There was, for sure. But it didn't shape the top level interactions at the political level. And crucially, it didn't shape crisis behavior. Now, the question is, do we have risk acceptant nuclear adversaries who are going to think about crisis situations very differently? The problem for the United States is that it increasingly, I'll go in the order. So I asked the question first of all about Russia, and Brigadier Segal sent me a very interesting paper the other day, suggesting that the Russians have been reading Kahn, and they've actually identified a range of escalation ladders. And that led me to think, well, imagine if Putin was playing Russia with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Imagine if we went back and, would he have followed Nikita Khrushchev's script, where Khrushchev was looking for a way out, was petrified by the idea that him and Kennedy were going to take the world over the edge into nuclear destruction? Or would he have done something which, Kennedy was really worried during the crisis Khrushchev might do, which is horizontally escalate to Berlin? Khrushchev could have opened up Berlin. Had he done so, that would have really put the Americans into a difficult position. But he didn't, because he recognized the need once his blood to the secret promise, which of course happened, and which they kept secret for years and years, showing the trust between them. In the end, I think Khrushchev had already decided that he was going to take those missiles out with the non-invasion pledge. There's no compelling evidence, smoking gun evidence, to suggest the Jupiters were critical. He clearly wanted the Jupiters, got the Jupiters, but I think he would have de-escalated this crisis without the commitment to remove the Jupiters. And then, so the question then, of course, we come to Ukraine, where, for the first time we've seen, in France, with Suez, but really this is the first time that, we've seen a Russian leader trying to manipulate nuclear threats and making warnings about escalation as a way of trying to deter NATO's involvement in Ukraine. It succeeded to some extent, of course, but you can debate how much, because NATO has steadily upped its level of involvement since the beginning of the conflict. You go back to February 2022, and you look at the level of involvement in the first 6 months, compare it to the involvement over time. So we can ask the question there. And of course, Biden, towards the end of his administration, authorized the use, gave the Ukrainians the authority to use the ATACMS in the deep strike role, and the British gave them the authority to use the Storm Shadows. I'm not sure, I'm trying to find out exactly what now Ukraine is allowed to do under Trump. It's not quite clear in the public domain at the moment, as far as I can find, but I'm trying to find out. Some of you may know, in which case I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on that. And then what about China? So one of my colleague, Phil Williams, who's wrote a great book on crisis management in the 1970s and has worked in this space for many years, he talks about this as Herman Cahan with a Chinese flavor. Lionel Morris's 2025 article is really interesting on this. The Chinese do seem to believe, according to a lot of the POA writings, that they might want to take escalatory actions early in a conflict. But in the hope, of course, that they can convince the Americans not in any way to intervene into any conflict over Taiwan. So they're trying to deter US involvement by convincing the Americans that they might be willing to do this, and also trying to convince the Americans that any kind of first strike against them would lead to escalation, that there wouldn't be a way in which the United States could hold hostage Chinese nuclear forces in such a way as to neutralize their assured destruction capability. Interestingly, Lyle Morris argues, and Rakesh Sood and Lyle Morris also have a paper on this, they argue that POA writings admit consideration, this is really fascinating, of how an adversary might perceive such escalatory reactions as threatening, believing that the defensive intent is clear. And I'll come on to that because this is a really profoundly important point, I think. And I think what coming back to escalation dominance, my sense is that as the conventional balance goes against the Americans more and more in the Taiwan Straits, the US is starting to look to an escalation dominance strategy to try to keep China in check. Now, of course, we don't know what Trump will do if the Chinese pushed it. We don't know whether Xi's instruction to the PLA to be ready by 2027 is really a serious one. But the US, I think, believes that the last thing they want to do is give the Chinese any kind of relationship of mutual vulnerability with the US, because that would weaken any idea that the US could manipulate its nuclear forces to try to deter the Chinese from pushing Taiwan. So you can see how we're setting up a very different set of possibilities here than in the first nuclear age. And so I asked the question, how much then is China's embrace of calm, if it really is, a response to what it perceives as the US doctrine of escalation dominance? So in other words, to what extent is this an action-reaction? And how far is the US really trying to develop escalation dominance over China? And or is that a misperception? I'm trying to think about how we can, I would much prefer us to try to explore the idea that there was a shared narrative. Others don't see us as we see ourselves. That others don't have the assurance that our intentions are defensive because they look at our capabilities and they see that those capabilities could do them enormous damage. And so what we found in our work on EDTs was that the side that had the technology believed that in their hands that technology was only going to be used for benign purposes. But when the adversary had that technology, or perceptions of it developing it in the future, then that was seen to be malign. So it was fundamental cognitive problem. This is my work I do on the security dilemma. It seems to me that there's a real security dilemma dynamic at work here. We fail to see that the technology that we have might be perceived as threatening by others. We need to put ourselves in their shoes and think about that. Similarly, we need to think about why the adversaries. The dual purpose problem with satellites, of course, is that you have a civilian satellite that can also be to all of us to think about the offense-defense differentiation problem. But I want to argue that if you layer that on top of the multiple nuclear adversary problem, the risk acceptance question, you start to get a very complicated world, as the Brigadier was saying. And fundamentally, we explore in the report to what extent EDTs do pose potential threats to strategic stability and this core assumption of mutual vulnerability. And so the fear here is that one side might, or both sides, in an adversarial relationship or in a multiple competition, might come to believe that somehow they have a technology that gives them a lasting strategic advantage. And we know through history the fallacy of that kind of thinking. You go back to the MIRV technology in the early 70s. The United States thought it was going to get a war-winning advantage with MIRV, but when the Soviets deployed MIRV on their own missiles, the Americans had major fears about the vulnerability of their land-based ICBMs. So, and then in the report, I think one of the really important features of the report, Part B looks at the cognitive drivers in more detail and talks about the offense-defense differentiation problem based on the dialogue we held. And then the third part, Part C, I think is really an important part of this in terms of building bridges across the divide. It's written by 4 writers, 2 Indians and 2 Pakistanis. It's a collaborative writing, a relatively rare thing. And they explore together policy prescriptions that came out of the second dialogue that we held as part of this project. And I would encourage you to have a look at that, because although the track 1 level is clearly very frozen at the moment, these ideas, I think, that we've got in this report open up spaces for thinking about how things might change. And then the final part, then we have a conclusion where we talk about the importance of coming back to communication, the the need to reinforce assumptions of mutual vulnerability. So I'm almost done. So the Brigadier Segal also anticipated this. I think we have to be careful with this a bit. So trade New York for Paris, and of course at the height of the third Taiwan Strait crisis in '96, you get a Chinese military official saying, you care a lot more about Los Angeles than you do about nuclear interactions. However, I think something qualitatively is changing, and I think that's the point. And I don't think it's just about Trump. I think it's about something we might call Trumpism. Is that there's an increasing question about whether the United States will really live up to these guarantees. And in this complex world that I've mapped out briefly, the uncertainties that abound and multiply, I think are making decision makers think more and more that they can't afford to be nuclear free. And the committee to investigate the wartime implications of atomic energy, the Moore Committee, became the beginnings of the British bomb. The committee concluded in their report to Churchill that no nation can afford to be caught without a weapon of such decisive possibilities. That was exactly the strategic logic that led this country into the nuclear weapons club, and it was exactly the strategic logic that led the United Kingdom into it. And so, in a world where people have seen the Americans potentially, abandon Ukraine, the Budapest world now where Zelensky is being squeezed very tightly, and where potentially some kind of duopoly between the United States and Russia might be emerging. People are starting to think really carefully about this, and you can see it in Europe. I mean, the Munich Security Conference set in motion a seismic set of movements, which I think just wouldn't have anticipated this a year or two ago. The British and the French now talking really seriously about what kind of collaboration could they have. A live debate in the UK now about whether the UK needs another leg to its nuclear deterrence. The UK is the only, if we take the US out of it, the UK is the only NATO state that is extending any kind of deterrence to the rest of the members of the alliance, because France, of course, is not part of the integrated nuclear planning structure. So I think it's a really interesting question. So what might be done? So I think crucially, we need to get back to mutual vulnerability as the basis for shared security. Mapped not just as a condition, but as a policy, as a doctrinal articulation. Going back to Reagan and Gorbachev, recognizing that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, and recognizing that strategic superiority has to be eschewed. Crucially, maintaining confidence in the other's restraints, in the other side's restraint. Building up restraint, I think, and resisting preemptive temptations, that has to be the fundamental. Critically, communication. That's what Kennedy and Khrushchev achieved during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We recommended in a report we published last year that India and Pakistan have a leader-to-leader hotline. At the moment, there's no leader-to-leader hotline. The idea that in the end, the only security in the nuclear age is common or mutual security. And it looks to the exercise of this idea of security dilemma sensibility, which I developed in the 2008 book, which is predicated on this idea that we put ourselves in the shoes of the other. We recognize how our own actions might have made the other fearful, and that we recognize that their behavior might be driven by fear and insecurity and not predatory intent. But at the same example of this, that security dilemma sensibility can sometimes be misplaced. Sometimes it can be the wrong choice, and sometimes it can get you. His father was the chancellor of my university, the first chancellor of my university, and the founder of it. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister in 1938, went to Munich to parley with Hitler. So he went in the belief that empathy might be a way of de-escalating the conflict. He was profoundly wrong, and the price was enormous. So I'm not saying that all conflicts are always driven by security dilemma dynamics, but where we think they might be, security dilemma sensibility is a really important antidote to the cognitive dynamics I talked about today. And crucially, we have to be prepared to test it out. And in my 2018 book, Trusting Enemies, I argue that face-to-face diplomacy is a really important mechanism for testing out this intuition of security dilemma sensibility. And in my new book, Atomic Bombs, we develop this argument much further. I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. But crucially, communication that builds security dilemma sensibility and trust, and this is my trouble for Marcus Holmes at the end here, is, I think, critical to stabilizing this third nuclear age. Thank you. I'm sorry I went over again.
So you mentioned 4 countries: India, DPRK, Pakistan, and Iran. So Israel was not mentioned anyways. I would like your comments on Israel and its position. Second thing, sir, definitely in light of the geopolitical scenario and the Russia-Ukraine war, the extended nuclear deterrence or extending the nuclear deterrence to non-nuclear powers or the allies by the US remains a suspect. But as late as 2022, sir, US released the nuclear posture review, wherein it has reaffirmed its commitment, and as late as 2023, the commitment stands as far as the US is concerned. So, will Trumpism or change in just the President of the United States, does it raise kind of the credibility which the US has extended so far? Does it remain a suspect, in your opinion? Thank you, sir.
Bans on tactical nuclear weapons by Pakistan. In your field of work, you said you've been interacting with both India and Pakistan on these issues. So do you feel that the use of tactical nuclear weapons as professed by Pakistan is a bluff, or would it actually provide them the leverage of countering the conventional asymmetry that it has militarily against India?
Its dominance or the hegemonic thing. Now, the moment you say that US is now considering both Russia and China as enemies and want to still further escalate its nuclear arsenal, then it is giving that indication that it wants to maintain an upper hand. Side by side, the second point which is emanating is that because in the like for Iran and DPRK, these threats are being thrown up so that people ask for extended cover. So it means that you want to keep people, means raise a threat and then want to keep the people under your umbrella so that it still gives you an upper hand to enlarge your thing. So some thoughts on that. Yeah, thank you.
That's great.
Last question here related to the subcontinent. Then you left it there. Do you think there is such a war is possible, or it is taking too much of a risk?
First is, if you look at nuclear doctrine of Russia now, use of nuclear weapons, preemptive use of nuclear weapons, the use of nuclear weapons against tactical missiles, right? Yeah. And look at the clouds that are hovering above over transatlantic alliance in Europe today, right? Yeah. And Trump is pushing Europeans into the front line to sort of face Russians.
Yes.
And there is a talk about Russian deployment there. Now, how will Europeans fight there? There is a talk about putting in the dock of some peacekeepers, there, which is a red line for Russia.
Yeah.
Now, if suppose these nuclear guarantees don't come, or at least it is perceived to be not coming from US to Europe, and if they want to take recourse to a heightened military posture against Russia, where do we that has become the number one risk factor as far as the nuclear, this dilemma of, what Europe is facing today. So how do you interpret that and how do you diffuse? I think that's a critical question today. And second thing is that why, for some reason, that still I feel that, China factor doesn't figure out too much as far as India's threat of so-called use of nuclear weapons with China is concerned, It is our deterrence is basically an indirect deterrence is that we want to have a nuclear capability, which may indirectly deter China, that we are a nuclear state, but it's not the other way around. But having fought so many wars, why is it still Europe thinks that South Asia, particularly Pakistan and India, is a nuclear flashpoint?
Indeed, they came close potentially to using them in 1973 when the existence of the Israeli state was imperiled. Clearly, the United States played a major role in the development of Israel's program. So I suppose it wasn't on the radar in the second nuclear age as one of the major proliferation challenges. Although, having said that, if you look at the 1995 Extension Conference of the NPT, the commitment to a Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone was critical to getting that agreement to extend the NPT. And I think if we could go back to 1995 now, there's a lot of non-nuclear weapon states who would not sign on to that indefinite extension of the treaty, because clearly they feel betrayed in terms not just of the disarmament provisions under Article 6 of the treaty, but also the Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone. And I think, that's so Israel remains, that nuclear capability remains a fundamental problem in the sense of trying to get some kind of nuclear weapons-free zone. But of course, we can see now that the conflict between Iran and Israel, that we've seen obviously kinetic activity there, limited albeit. Clearly the Iranians, the nervousness now in Iran and the determination to think about crossing the threshold, is clearly very high. But if they can find another way of doing that, because they're obviously worried about being attacked as they try to transition, and clearly the talks that are taking place now are attempted by the Iranians to try to find a different way forward with the Americans, in the hope that the Americans will then restrain the Israelis. So, I mean, if there is to be any kind of deal, it won't just be about lifting sanctions, it will also be a hope that they can put some pressure on Israel to not, so that Iran will feel more protected, I think. So, I mean, it's a good point. I don't think I have an answer, but I could have mentioned that if I had more time. It's as well that the Major General was making. I mean, as I said, extended deterrence concerns have been there a long time, but I think in the past, the United States has made enormous steps to try to reassure the Europeans, try to find ways to reassure the Europeans, whether that was the deployment of cruise and Pershing in the late 70s and early 1980s. There's been all sorts of attempts to try to establish coupling. The problem with the Trump administration is that they're not doing anything to try to actually show that they're committed in any way to coupling. Far from it. The rhetoric coming out of the White House is you're on your own. And then coming back to the point about the really interesting point, Major General, about the peacekeeping force. Starmer's on record saying that British troops would go into a ceasefire situation, but only if there's an American backstop. So already there's the implication that the Americans have to be involved in some way militarily. There has to be some kind of US involvement, even if that's just air, some kind of air patrols or whatever. But the other condition that the British Prime Minister has established is a durable ceasefire, which looks extremely difficult. And at what point do you have a durable ceasefire? Now, also, if you take the Russian narrative seriously, the idea that they're going to allow NATO forces to be policing the ceasefire when the whole argument is that it's I think, profoundly problematic. Now, I think but the difficulty is that I don't think, if you've thought about sort of a Chapter 6 UN peacekeeping force and you have the very interesting figure outside that I took a photograph of, who was involved in the first peacekeeping operation with Dag Hammarskjöld in the Sinai. If you have that kind of Chapter 6 peacekeeping force, I don't think that's going to reassure the Ukrainians, because they're not going to feel that that's very much to hold the Russians. So, and you're not going to get a Chapter 7 one because the Russians can veto it in the Security Council. So I'm really struggling to see. So whilst I think India could play a really interesting role here, if the peacekeeping is Chapter 6, it's difficult to see how that would reassure the Ukrainians. And yet, if it's NATO forces which would reassure the Ukrainians, it's difficult to see how that's going to work with the Russians. So this is very tricky. But clearly, the worry for European states is that if the Americans do have a radical reset on the transatlantic relationship, then they're left exposed ultimately to a Russia that can rebuild and has something like 2,000 2,000 tactical, non-strategic nuclear weapons. And so that's where the debate's coming in then about Europe's going to need some kind of Euro nuclear deterrent. And where's that going to come from? At the moment, that only looks like it could come from the British and the French. But there's talk in Germany in a way that there hasn't been, but that obviously raises all sorts of political sensitivities. And yet Germany, in terms of being a threshold state, is probably closer to getting the bomb than some of the other states that we might think about. You know, it's the South Koreas and the Japans and the Germanys that are the ones that could probably move quickly to weapons capability. But the political sensitivities there, I think, are enormous. The tactical nuclear weapon question is a really, really good one. So I think Pakistan's position is analogous to NATO's position in the 1950s and 1960s. So they believe that they're conventionally inferior, and they believe that in order to deter India's use of conventional forces, just as NATO wanted to deter the Soviet use of conventional forces, that they need a spectrum of escalation. That they can't just rely on strategic nuclear forces, that they need.
The extended aspects of doctrine subsumes nuclear weapons. At the low end of the subsumption of the nuclear weapons is the tactical nuclear weapons. The whole ballgame is to prevent escalation management or escalation control by India, which is detrimental to their security. Period. I can share a paper with you. My good friend right now is lying in Kola in Pakistan. General Qureshi, he wrote a paper. We both discussed that. I'm part of another dialogue in which we presented that paper. But I can share that.
Has been kinetic uses of force between the two sides. Most recently, of course, the Balakot. And it hasn't escalated. So I think there is so what we argued in the report last year is that, and I'd be really happy to share this with people, but it's very available online, is that there is this kind of shared implicit confidence on both sides that they know where each other's red lines are. Now, I think what we argue in the report is that there are some pillars that support that, and we go through those, and I can talk about those if people want me to at this time. But we argued those pillars are now in a process of fraying, and there's a need for more new guardrails. And then we suggest some ideas of what those guardrails might look like, including a leader-to-leader hotline. But I think it is interesting because one of the things we've tried really hard to do is to deep in our work, and I hope, our work is tried to be as non-ethnocentric and culturally sensitive as can be coming from the outside. And as I say, working very much with local partners and trying to engage and learn and co-create, is that we've tried really hard to demolish the nuclear flashpoint mythology. So in the report last year, the April 24 report, we begin by critiquing the flashpoint mythology because, I think it fails to understand the sources of crisis management the two sides have actually been able to develop. And I think that's really interesting. But those sources need reinforcement. And I think that's and then the China factor. Yeah, it's very interesting. But I suppose the final comment from me. And this is around questions. I suppose the difficulty is that however much India and China, the nuclear factor might not be salient in the relationship today, I guess the fear is that when they have 1,000 or 1,500 nuclear weapons or more, then, and India is trying to kind of respond to that, presumably, its assured destruction capability will need to maintain a credible minimum deterrent. That then could set off a situation where potentially nuclear weapons could become more salient in the relationship. So the challenge is to try to figure out how you can marginalize nuclear weapons in the India-China relationship. Okay. What can be done about this reduction? Yeah, sorry.
No, okay. See, the whole notion which can impact China and can cause destruction which is unmanageable from the Chinese perspective. The escalation is controlled. So once the escalation is controlled, you have much more defined parameters of conflict. And within that defined parameters of conflict, what we have been doing is, I'm talking about this is my theory, is basically following an interesting strategy from Indian perspective. This strategy is called military deterrence backed by diplomatic de-escalation. If you see how we have treated the last 4.5 years of our thing with the Chinese, is based on this strategy. And our attempt to create a missile force, attempt to create nerve capability, attempt to create a long-range vectors are all part of the same dissuasive deterrence capability to let the other person know or having long-range missile system on a nuclear subject. The whole idea basically is to deter the other person that you have the capacity to hurt him. And that hurt is something which the same analogy applies. Chinese have got 600 weapons to 3,000 weapons of the Americans. The Americans are dissuaded, right? They don't want to go to So the whole idea is this. And as we fine-tune your nuclear capability in multiple ways, and as we start fielding our so-called non-strategic, strategic non-nuclear weapons capability in terms of precision and all that capability that we will be able to have, that will be having a much more deterrence value. So we may not at all have to use nuclear weapons against China. But if we can upgrade our strategic non-nuclear weapons and be able to hit him precisely, and he knows that it can be hit, I mean, he can be a target, not that you have to target him. That is a part of dissuasive deterrence. So this whole notion of dissuasive deterrence have to be, played up and understood from my perspective.
I guess my question back to you, Brigadier, would be, can India afford not to respond to China's nuclear modernization?
Will respond, but application of its capacity and capability in a manner it feels that is dissuasive deterrence remains better. In what ways it will do it, I'm not going to spell it out, but we will do it, and we are doing it, and we shall be able to do it to ensure the credibility of our deterrence is never undermined vis-a-vis the China.
But then that's going to have implications for
Well, there's a paper on this. I can share there's a paper with Raji Haripur in Australia, places. Think tanks.
Yeah, the Australian policies.
But there is one more thing which needs to be realized. The DG had pointed out the build-up of the Chinese thing. So I think India, in the present circumstances, also have to be careful that it is not pushed into a direction where we see that we're gonna fight a war with China. Things can be different tomorrow, right? So therefore, just to go by the narrative that we are going to be perpetual enemies here, I think maybe a wrong narrative to take home. So I think we ought to be thinking ourselves also that how far we need to go on that line and keep our lines clear.
Secondary nuclear detonation, right? The NBC attacks with non-executability, right? The false flag operation, that will come in there. The use of AI and machine learning and such like things to cripple, paralyze your command, control, communication, facilities like Stuxnet. This was a very deadly attack. No, these are the issues of concern. Even the very safety of your nuclear facilities, in terms where your processing is taking place. Some, accident can take place, like something like Chernobyl or thing like that. Those are other aspects. And one more issue, I think, willy-nilly, at some stage, the countries will have to come to a negotiation table, whether it is your new start, whether it's your CTBT, whether it's your INF, by incorporating other players like China.
Yes.
Today, it is not, the whole debate is not limited to.
That's the point being made, sir.
Yes, US and China, US and Russia. There are other players who come, and I think I would like to have your views on some of these issues.
I think that's really important. So, having this capability of holding hostage American cities, this mutual vulnerability, and recognise that as a basis. So, if you go back and look at the history, the Soviet Union refused to sit down with the United States until it had nuclear parity. Nuclear parity was fundamental. So SALT only began when the Soviets had strategic nuclear parity. And I think the Chinese have a similar mindset. But if you talk to the Americans, they will tell you privately, or the Americans I've spoken to anyway. I'm not sure about this administration. But I've spoken to some of the people in the first Trump administration and people in the Biden administration. There's an unwillingness at the moment in the United States to recognize that the Chinese should have nuclear parity with the United States. And that's a really profoundly interesting. So if that shifts, because the other thing about Trump is, of course, he's totally unpredictable, and he does have a history of talking about the importance of trying to have some kind of nuclear disarmament. So there's always black swan moments in international relations, they come along. So it's not impossible that there might be some kind of transformation in this landscape. And I could be back in a year saying, well, it's like Reykjavik all over again kind of thing. Suddenly you've got, transformation. So we always have to be careful with these things. But at the moment, the direction of travel in American nuclear strategy is not to accord the Chinese a position of neutral vulnerability vis-a-vis the United States. And I don't think the Chinese will be party to anything that doesn't recognize them as being equal. And that goes deep into Chinese culture, right? About equal respect and all that. So that makes things profoundly difficult, because if the Chinese won't come in until they get parity, they are going to be chasing parity. And if the Americans believe they've got to have parity with both China and Russia combined, because they think they could be fighting a war on two fronts, effectively, a nuclear war on two fronts, then that means it's very difficult to see where restraint comes in. But I strongly agree with your point, Chairman, which is that we need to find ways of trying to restrain competition between China and India. We need to look at how we can open up risk reduction mechanisms and possibilities, communication, hotlines, and so on, so as to get the diplomatic de-escalation firmly grounded in the relationship. So I'm not trying to in any way kind of much light on restraint and responsibility. It's about trying to think about how we can make mutual vulnerability the condition of engagement within this nuclear multipolar space. A Rakesh Sud said yesterday, the problem is that we've got a multipolar world, but we haven't got a multipolar border. And trying to think about how you bring order to this nuclear multipolarity, I think, I try to suggest some of the ways I think that might happen. At the core of that, it seems to me, is this dissuasive deterrence and mutual vulnerability.
So critical deterrence is the Chinese, primarily to ensure that collective security mechanism that they try to create for Indo-Pacific stays in place. And that part of the collective, the facade of deterrence is the extended deterrence. Now, extended deterrence is under pressure, under threat. So what happens? What happens now? So if that facade breaks out, the credibility of American power in Asia gets devolved. And if that gets undermined, then we are looking at an entirely very different prospects. So that's something we.
And that was the linkage of its Asian allies and potentially Taiwan drives it into believing that it needs to have options short of the mutual vulnerability strategy. And that drives it into counter forces it has done with the European story. So that's the tension now is mobilized against them, but in a context where China is getting closer to them, where it becomes more difficult. So the US is trying to get that edge, it's trying to get that escalation edge, so that in a crisis situation, it would be able to compel, back to Herman Kahn, compel the Chinese to back down, to convince the Allies not to proliferate. But at the same time, the Allies are profoundly worried about whether they can really rely on the Americans to do any of this, because of the way in which the Americans have been talking about, European security. That sends shockwaves through Asia about what does that mean for our security. So I think because the messaging is so challenging for the Allies, and two members of the alliance are potentially under threat from the United States. I mean, you couldn't, it's like, the Greenland and Canada story. I mean, when people see that, they start to think, well, what does this mean for us? And can we really rely on this? And even if you strip away the rhetoric and say, well, that's just Trump, this is the material realities of this leading to raise question. questions.
So, the deterrence and doctrines and policies of nuclear are mostly related to offensive nuclear doctrines, generally. And also, second strike and this, that. Does any doctrine, any policy, or any talk go around subversions of damaging nuclear power plants or weapon sites, or any of these things which is equally damaging? If not, why do you need to strike? If you can see power plants goes, the country is gone, or even a major area is gone. Does any thought process go around, sir, in your interactions or whatever studies this? I mean, I was just thinking because it's equal damage.
That's the Major General's point. Undersea cables and so on. And, we had some warehouse fires in the UK last year that was very unclear. There's drone flights over RAF bases that are not clear where they're coming from. There's the pipeline issue. So there's a whole kind of
is there a policy, formal policy? Do people think on these lines?
Yeah, I think strategic planners definitely think about that for sure.
Nothing declared.
But I would just push back on one point. I think we have to be careful when we talk about offensive nuclear doctrines. And what I think about when I talk about an offensive nuclear doctrine is the idea that we use nuclear weapons. We believe that nuclear weapons can be used for more than just deterrence. That they can be used for either nuclear warfighting, or they can be used for intimidatory purposes, coercive purposes. The idea of a mad relationship between two states, I would actually call that defensive. Even though the weapon is going in to destroy the other side.
So it is destroying before it goes.
Yeah, but it's defensive in the sense that what you're doing is you're essentially you're holding the other side's cities hostage. They're holding your cities hostage. It's a deterrent. It's a dissuasive deterrent relationship. So essentially, the nuclear weapons are being used in a defensive role, not an offensive role, because they're upholding deterrence. So I think that's an important distinction. The idea of using nuclear weapons for intimidation, coercion, escalation, dominance, that pushes you into the offensive space. So I wouldn't want to hold on to that.
Can I just add one small point? Some of the national critical infrastructure, how much of a threat it is. For example, our military satellites, our military communication infrastructure, an ASAT attack on action on the part of the enemy indicates to us that it is a preemptive attack of a high degree of degradation, and I must respond. So this is something which we are.
What a merit second. We have recently seen during the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Russia has hit the nuclear plant of Ukraine in Zaporizhia in southern Ukraine.
Yeah.
Though it's a power generation plant, however, if this can happen, so the plants carrying the nuclear missiles can also be hit. So this is already some. It has damaged the power generation capability of Ukraine again. A lot of this
still very, very important issue, and also thank Sagan, who's been our mentor, and who raised the center for strategic studies here, and we are just,
For you?
Honored to be here.
Thank you. And I just want to say we really, it's a very fascinating sort of presentation you made, because you put in a very sound conceptual framework, which in the military we mostly look at the offshoots and we don't get into the fundamental issues. So it has added to our own understanding. But in conclusion, I would say, you see, nuclear weapons were deemed to be the currency of power, and that is what gave them the place at the high table to the nuclear fire. Right? So that is the reason they don't want to give up nuclear weapons. Otherwise, the raw logic will tell you disarmament is the only way possible, and when you don't have a knife in your pocket, then who will you kill? Right? But they don't want to give up that currency of power. That is one. Second thing, I think because of Ukraine war, nuclear weapons have again come to the fore. Otherwise, by and large, they were sort of, getting mellowed down in the strategic calculus of many countries. They had these weapons, but it is the Ukraine war which has brought them to the fore. third issue, I think that many people say, well, the new Deterrence is actually going to be about artificial and machine learning, the algorithm wars. And with the advent of algorithm wars, when you can paralyze everything, the whole paradigm is undergoing to shift, and maybe nuclear weapons will take a back seat. And fourth thing, I think the space, counter-space capabilities which are now coming up, and the pace with which disruptive technology is moving, maybe 10 years down the line, the very tone and tenor of this nuclear debate could be different. This is my...
Oh, absolutely. That's what this new report talks about. The basic report is all about that only.
So we have to keep our tentacles up. Do not wish away this as an impending and immediate threat, and some confidence building measures and hotlines and something, building of the strategic mistrust. These steps must take off. Otherwise, we'll get into some kind of a nuclear Armageddon. But at the same time, I think we should keep our tentacles up to look at threats which are going to be far more debilitating and more dangerous than the very existence of nuclear weapons in our hands.
Thank you.
So with these words, I thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
May I request Professor to please accept a small token from our side.
Thank you. Thank you.
In India, we still hide our souvenirs. Abroad, they just tear it off immediately and want to see.
Thank you very much.
Sir, this is for you. For you. Go ahead.
Honor to be here.
Thank you.